He-Man and Masters of the Universe. Warlord of Eternia. Skeletor, Lord of Destruction, stood on the highest peak of Snake Mountain and gazed across the rolling landscape of Eternia. Out there were his enemies, the King and Queen of Eternia, and their allies, the Masters of the Universe. Skeletor's war against the forces of good was never ending. Each time victory seemed within his grasp, something went wrong. Far below, Skeletor could see a band of his slaves laboring at some task or other.
"That is my mistake," he exclaimed. "It is I who do all the work in my fight for power over the planet. I protect those miserable creatures as any good slave master should. They do nothing. They are not even grateful."
Skeletor made up his mind. He would no longer fight alone and would recruit a vast army from among the slaves of Snake Mountain and the trolls, orcs, gnolls, and other evil beings over whom he was lord. That very day he sent out a summons to his people to gather at Snake Mountain for the coming campaign. They crept out of the dark caverns of the ice mountains, the thickets of the vine jungle, the wild sand dunes and shattered rocks along the shore of the Sea of Rakash. They crowded around the base of Snake Mountain, squabbling and fighting among themselves. Skeletor looked over his rabble of an army. Then he sent for Zodak.
"You have served me well in the past," he said. "Now is your chance to do me even greater service. Turn that wretched rabble into an army. They need discipline and training. You will give it to them."
Zodak worked hard, but it was not easy. At last he drew up his forces to be inspected by their evil master. Skeletor stood on a rocky ledge and looked down at his troops. Banners flying and weapons at the ready, they roared out a greeting to the Lord of Destruction. Skeletor raised his hand for silence.
"Together," he cried, "we will defeat once and for all those puny beings who dare to call themselves the King and Queen of Eternia. Soon Eternia will enter a new age. One planet, one people, one leader. Forward!" cried Skeletor. "We march immediately on the royal palace of Eternia."
In a long column, Skeletor's army moved out from Snake Mountain. In the royal palace, King Randor and his council already knew that Skeletor was planning to lead an army against them. The report said that the enemy had made camp and taken up positions about 5 miles away. Under cover of night, the Eternian royal forces set out, and before dawn they were lined up, ready for battle. In Skeletor's camp, Zodak raged at the soldiers. Despite all his training, they still fought among themselves. During the night, there had been rioting in the camp, and now, as the sun rose, a fearful sight greeted them. In perfect formation, the army of Eternia faced them across less than a mile of open ground. Banners flapped in the breeze. The sun shone on weapons, but not a man moved. With perfect discipline, they waited. Zodak began shouting orders. His troops ran in all directions at once. Some had lost their weapons. Others had forgotten what company they belonged to. At length they were in some sort of order, lined up, facing the enemy. Skeletor rode up on Panther. He took up his position in front.
"Now," he cried, "is your moment of glory. We shall drive these weaklings from the field like frightened sheep. Charge!"
But even as he spoke, a squabble had broken out among the trolls, and some of the orcs were trying to sneak away without being noticed. Skeletor drew his sword. He held it aloft. He was on the point of giving the command to attack when, from the Eternian ranks, the royal trumpeters sounded the charge. In a moment, the Lord of Destruction's mighty host was a screaming mob in full retreat. In almost no time at all, Skeletor stood alone amid a litter of dropped weapons. Another trumpet call drew Skeletor's attention. King Randor had ridden out from the ranks of his army. He called to Skeletor, "Admit you have been beaten. Give up your foolish struggle, and let all Eternia live at peace."
"Never!"
screamed Skeletor.
"This is just a beginning. Mark my words."
And, shaking his fist at the king, he mounted Panther and rode back to Snake Mountain. For weeks, no one dared approach the Lord of Destruction. Alone in his lair, he brooded on his failure. His army had scattered. Zodak had been banished in disgrace to the sulfur mines. Only Evil Lyn remained at his side.
"Why am I served by cowards and weaklings?"
Skeletor muttered.
"There was a time when I could have led a host of mighty warriors to certain victory."
"There was a time when Eternia was young," said Evil Lyn, "when all Eternians were warriors. Those were the days of the Warlord of Eternia." Skeletor shook his head.
"I would give anything to have such as those under my command, but now that is impossible."
"It might not be," said Evil Lyn. "There was a time when the people of Eternia traveled through time itself as easily as we travel across the planet. The secret has long been lost, but if it could be found—"
"Well?"
said Skeletor. "If you could journey back to the days of the Warlord of Eternia, you could have your pick of the fiercest warriors our planet has ever known."
"Old wives' tales!" shouted Skeletor. "You tire me with your chatter, witch. Go and leave me in peace."
After Evil Lyn had gone, Skeletor began to think about what she had said. Might not there still be, somewhere, records of time travel? Skeletor went down into the secret caverns of Snake Mountain to find the ancient parchments, stone tablets, and books. Some were written in forgotten languages, but many held strange secrets of the ancient Eternians. In a dark corner, hidden by dust and cobwebs, Skeletor found an ancient iron box. Inside, he found sheets of yellow parchment covered with figures and strange symbols. In the flickering light of a lantern, Skeletor began to read and gave a shout of triumph.
"I have it!"
he cried.
"The secret of time travel is here for the taking."
Skeletor returned to the upper levels of his lair and sent for Evil Lyn.
"I need your help," he said as Evil Lyn entered. "You were right about time travel. I need you to help me make the calculations."
"Can't your faithful computer help?" asked Evil Lyn.
"No, it can't, witch,"
snapped Skeletor.
"These ancient figures are too primitive for it to understand. It needs someone with a simple brain. That's why I've chosen you."
He took the sheets of parchment from the box and spread them on the table. Then they started work. From time to time, slaves crept in with food and drink, but the calculations went on all that day and into the night. The floor of Skeletor's chamber was covered with paper as the sun set and shadows crept across Snake Mountain. Skeletor sat back and looked at Evil Lyn.
"Well, witch," he said, "that's it. We have the answer."
Evil Lyn looked at her notes. "Yes," she said. "We now have the coordinates of one of the forgotten time corridors. We also have time factors worked out. All that we have to do now is to find the place and calculate the hour." Skeletor crossed the chamber to a large map of Eternia.
"The coordinates make the place here, in the desert," he said.
"Of course," said Evil Lyn. "The sands of time.
I've heard strange tales of them. Time vortices that drag people back into the past, never to be seen again." "Ridiculous fairy tales," snarled Skeletor. "Our ancestors controlled the time corridors. Fools and simpletons were afraid and made up these legends."
Skeletor began to plan his journey back into the past to recruit warriors for his fight against the powers of good. He decided not to go alone. Evelyn must be there, as she understood time traveling, and he needed a fighter in case they ran into trouble. He would take Beastman. A few days later, the three evil companions boarded a hover car and set out for the desert and the sands of time. They reached the edge of the desert, and as the hover car sped across the sand, Evelyn checked their position.
"We must be at the entrance to the time corridor by evening," she said. "The time vortex we need is activated by the rising of the moon. If we are late, we shall not have another chance for a month."
Skeletor brought the hover car to a halt close to the edge of a wide, rocky gully.
"We'll walk the last few yards," said Evelyn.
She led the way as they scrambled down into the gully and out at the other side. A faint moon glow was in the eastern sky as they came to what seemed to be a flat slab of rock, half buried in the sand.
"This is it,"
said Evelyn. They saw that the rock was really an area of rough paving. It formed a circle, and around the edge were fragments of broken stone set upright in the sand.
"Quickly, into the center,"
said Evelyn, as the moon slowly rose above the horizon. Nothing happened at first. Then the sand seemed to shimmer. The circle began to spin, and the three figures huddled together in the center. The moon was blotted out. Skeletor, Evelyn, and Beastman could see nothing, not even each other. They were caught in a whirlwind of spinning darkness. Then the spinning slowed down and the darkness grew less. There was only the moonlight. They looked around them and saw that they stood on a smooth stone floor. Above their heads, a domed roof was supported by carved stone pillars. High above the horizon, the moon shone brightly. There was a sound of running water nearby. Far off were lights as from a city. Skeletor said,
"I think that we are in exactly the same place as before, but 2,000 years in the past. We will wait until daylight before we make a move."
They rested uncomfortably on the stone floor, and at last day began to break. Beyond the stone pillars was a new world. There was no desert. The countryside stretched green and fertile all around. The rocky gully was a fast-flowing river. There was no sign of the hover car on the far bank. Holding their energy weapons at the ready, Skeletor and Evelyn left the stone building, and, followed by Beastman with his stun whip, they made their way across a road towards where they had seen the lights. They saw the towers of a great city, and standing above everything was a castle. They were within a mile of the city walls when Beastman grunted. "Something comes," he said. In a few minutes, a troop of mounted warriors galloped up and surrounded the three strangers. The leader looked down at them. "Who are you?" he asked. "Who dares to approach the castle of the warlord without permission?"
"Stand aside, dog," snarled Skeletor. "I, a Skeletor, Lord of Destruction, need permission of no man to go about my business."
"And what is your business?" asked the soldier.
"That is between me and your master," cried Skeletor. "Stand aside."
And he aimed his energy weapon. But nothing happened. Evelyn drew hers, and again nothing happened. "Take them prisoner," cried the troop leader. The troopers leapt from their horses. Skeletor and Evelyn struggled fiercely. Beastman used the stun whip as an ordinary whip, and had laid low half of the soldiers before he, like the others, was overpowered and bound with chains. They were each chained to a horse and forced to trudge behind the troop. Skeletor, Evelyn, and Beastman passed through a massive gateway in the city wall. Then they were led higher and higher through the city until they crossed a drawbridge and entered through another gate. They were prisoners in the castle of the Warlord of Eternia. In the great hall of the castle, the warlord sat surrounded by his knights and other warriors. Suddenly, the door at the end of the hall flew open, and a messenger came in. "Your lordship," he said, "3 strangers were arrested an hour ago on the great road. They can give no sensible account of themselves." "Describe them," said the warlord. "One is a wild, hairy fellow," said the messenger, "and something of a warrior. He fought skillfully with a whip-like weapon. The second is clearly a madman, and they are accompanied by a female. A slave, I presume." "Keep them well guarded," said the warlord. "I will examine them this evening." The prisoners were led deep into the rock below the castle. There they were put into separate cells. The footsteps of the guards died away. Skeletor waited. Then, summoning all his mental energy, he sent out a thought message to Beastman and Evelyn. They quickly replied by the same means.
"When we meet the warlord, all will be put right," said Skeletor. "Someone has made a terrible mistake."
"We are the ones who made the mistake," said Evelyn, "coming here in the first place. We are helpless. Our weapons do not work because we are in a different time zone when energy weapons did not exist. Our only hope is to escape. We must reach the time corridor exit when the moon is in the right phase."
"That gives us a month,"
said Skeletor. "Less a day," said Beastman. Later, when night had fallen, the cell doors were thrown open. They were led up to the great hall and brought before the Warlord of Eternia. As Skeletor caught sight of the warlord, he screamed out,
"This is a disgrace. I demand that you release us immediately. I am Skeletor, Lord of Destruction. You will rue this day, I tell you."
"What is he talking about?" asked the warlord. "I don't know," said the guard. "He's been raving on like that ever since he was captured." "The fellow's mad," exclaimed the warlord, "and probably dangerous. Keep him locked up and chained until I decide what to do with him. Take the female to the servants' quarters." Then the warlord turned to Beastman. "Now, my fine fellow," he said, "you are indeed a warrior after my own heart. It surprises me that you are served by such as the madman. Who are you?" "They call me Beastman," was the reply. "Well, Beastman," said the warlord, "whips are used by my wagon drivers and slave masters, but no one has ever seen a whip used as a weapon. I would like to see it for myself." He clapped his hands, and a slave came forward carrying a long-necked, 2-handled wine jar. The company cleared a space in the center of the hall, and the girl was made to stand with the jar balanced on her head. "Now, show me," said the warlord. A guard handed Beastman his stun whip. He pressed the control, but the energy pack was still dead. He cracked the whip, and taking a quick aim, he flicked the lash at the wine jar, sending one of the handles spinning to the floor. Almost in the same second, the other handle followed. With a loud crack, the whip curled round the neck and broke it off. Then, with an evil smile, Beastman smashed the jar to pieces, scattering wine in all directions. The slave ran out of the hall screaming. The company cheered and clapped. The warlord said, "One more test." He signaled to a guard who ran forward and hurled a spear at Beastman. But the spear had barely left the man's hand before the whip had snaked out and snatched it from the air. The warlord looked at Beastman. "Serve me as a warrior," he said. "With you by my side, I shall be invincible. You will be numbered among the greatest in the land. You will have power and riches second only to myself." Beastman stood, silent and confused. He was half animal, The human part of him wanted to say yes, but the animal part only knew Skeletor as master. Skeletor was in trouble, and it was up to Beast-Man to help him. He slowly shook his shaggy head. The warlord looked angry for a moment. "Very well," he said. "You may change your mind, but I want you to train a regiment of my soldiers to fight with whips. You will live with them in the barracks. You will neither be chained nor return to your dungeon." "If I do what you ask," said Beast-Man, "will you set Skeletor and Evil Lyn free?" "Your servants?" said the warlord. "You are a thoughtful master. In less than a month we hold the great games. If you fight and defeat an opponent of my choosing, they will be set free to return to their own country." "And I with them?" "Yes," said the warlord. "By then I should have whip fighters enough. All three of you may leave then." Alone in his dungeon, Skeletor knew nothing of what was happening to Beast-Man. Evil Lyn went as a servant with the guard who took Skeletor his food. "You're lucky. Your master has found favor with the warlord," said the guard.
"Our what?"
screamed Skeletor.
"He means Beast-Man," said Evil Lyn.
"Yes, the hairy one with the whip," said the guard. "He lives in comfort and teaches his skills to the warlord's soldiers. He is to fight in the arena at the great games. If he wins, you will go free. At least, that is what the warlord says, but I wouldn't be so sure." Evil Lyn asked the guard when the games were to be held. When he had gone, she whispered to Skeletor,
"You know what this means? On the same day as the games, we must be at the time corridor at moonrise if we are to return to our own time."
Beast-Man was enjoying himself training the soldiers to use a whip. They held him in great awe and called him Sir. He began to think that perhaps he should enter the service of the warlord and forget about Skeletor and Evil Lyn. The day of the games arrived, and the warlord sent for Beast-Man. "As my champion, and as a special treat for my people, you will be the last to fight in the arena. I have reserved a worthy opponent for you. See to it that you give us good sport."
"And when I win?" asked Beast-Man.
"All is arranged," said the warlord. "A chariot and horses will be ready to take you and your servants back to your home immediately after the games. And, to show my generosity, your people shall watch you fight for their freedom." All morning, crowds had been pouring down the hill and out of the city gates to the great arena. At midday, a fanfare announced the approach of the warlord. He came leading a long procession of mounted knights and other warriors. Riding at his right hand was Beast-Man. The warlord took his seat. The guards led Evil Lyn and Skeletor, now without his chains, to the other side of the arena. There was another fanfare of trumpets, and the games began. There were wrestlers and boxers, horse races, chariot races, and warriors who fought with swords and spears. The sun was low in the sky when the trumpet sounded again, and the crowd fell quiet. A gate at one end was thrown open, and Beast-Man, his whip in his hand, strode to the center of the arena. The crowd cheered, then waited silently. Slowly, a huge pair of iron doors swung open at the other end of the arena. Something moved in the shadows. Then, into the crimson light of the setting sun, came a giant manticore. The crowd gasped. Even Beast-Man took a step back. The creature turned its almost human face to look at Beast-Man. The muscles of its lion-like body rippled as it stretched its dragon's wings and swung its scorpion tail from side to side. Then, without warning, it charged. Beastman threw himself to one side, just avoiding the stinging tail as the manticore charged past. He then leapt to his feet and aimed the long whip, but as it cracked out, the manticore soared into the air with its wings outspread. It circled just out of range, while Beastman turned with it, waiting for the next attack. The creature made a sudden swoop. This time Beastman was ready. The whip cracked, and its lash bit through the manticore's thick fur. Enraged, it hovered over Beastman's head, ready to strike. Beastman tried to reach it with the whip, but the manticore kept its distance, just out of range. Beastman suddenly turned and ran. The manticore followed, and the crowd booed. Beastman ignored the boos. He ran as hard as he could for the side of the arena. There he stopped, his back against the wall. The manticore, with a scream of triumph, swooped down on its victim and swerved away at the last moment. The manticore could not attack Beastman from the air without striking the wall. It soared round and dropped to the ground. Then, cautiously, it began to creep forward. Beastman watched as it came closer. He flicked out the whip and cracked it in the air. The manticore glanced up, but did not stop. Slowly, the gap narrowed. The whip was now snapping the air above the beast's head. It was confused. What was its enemy up to? Beastman sent the long whip whistling out, not over the manticore's head, but into the sand in front of it. The sand flew up in the creature's face. Holding the whip by the tip of the lash, Beastman swung the heavy handle around his head. The lash wrapped itself tightly around the manticore's legs, then its wings and tail, until it lay helpless in the sand of the arena. The crowd cheered. Beastman turned to where the warlord sat. "I have kept my part of the bargain," he cried. "Will you now keep yours?" The warlord made a sign, and Beastman was escorted out of the arena. A chariot stood waiting, and Skeletor and Evelyn were already there. Beastman jumped aboard, and Evelyn took the reins. "We must hurry," said Skeletor. "It is not long to moonrise." "And I do not trust the warlord," said Evelyn. "It's all too easy." In the gathering dusk, they clattered along the road. Then they saw the domed building with the carved pillars. The moon had not yet risen. "We've made it!" cried Skeletor. "Not yet," cried Beastman. "Listen!" Behind on the road they heard hoofbeats. Beastman jumped from the moving chariot. "You go on," he cried. "I'll delay them." The riders rode up swiftly. "The warlord has changed his mind," cried the leader. He was one of those taught to use a whip by Beastman. The man lashed out with his whip. Beastman, faster than the eye could see, threw up his arm and let the lash curl round it. Then, with a jerk, he pulled the man from the saddle. "I didn't teach you everything," he shouted. In a moment, the other soldiers were in full retreat. The moon was barely below the horizon. "Hurry!" shouted Evelyn as she and Skeletor stood under the dome. Beastman reached the building and stopped, suddenly thoughtful. If he stayed, he might still be somebody in the service of the Warlord of Eternia. Then Skeletor grasped him by the arm and pulled him into the center of the circle of columns. As they stood, the moon slowly rose in the eastern sky. The sky and the moonlit landscape seemed to spin and fade, and Skeletor, Evelyn, and Beastman huddled together on a circle of crumbling paving stones in the middle of the desert. "We're back," said Evelyn. There was no highway, no city lights, no grass. The river was a dry gully. On the far side of the gully, the hover car stood waiting. They made their way back to it. "You've forgotten something," said Evelyn to Skeletor. "What's that, witch?" You were going to recruit an army of warriors. Remember? Skeletor screamed with rage. As the hover car started on its journey back to Snake Mountain, Beastman looked back. I think I'll go back there someday, he said.
If you go anywhere, it will be to the sulfur mines,
shouted Skeletor. Beastman said nothing more. He just thought, if I do go back, it will be to return with an army. Then Eternia will have a new Lord of Destruction. The hover car sped across the planet while Skeletor brooded on what his next move should be in his war against the powers of good.